Welcome to part 3 of our reflections on the Confessions of St. Augustine. Today we're going to be focusing on the period of Augustine's life that we would describe as adolescence. In contrast to last week's infancy and childhood, I think we're going to find this is going to be one of the most vivid times of Augustine's life. Augustine's adolescence was, first of all, event-filled. And I think for most of us, adolescence is a memorable time of life, perhaps not always positive memories, but adolescence stands out, and in Augustine's case, profoundly stands out. So I think you'll find this getting livelier as time goes on. We're going to begin with a quote from Augustine, and then we'll explain it. "He who created us without our help will not save us without our consent." Augustine is reminding us here that God seeks our love, and our love can only be freely given. It can never be forced. It is our consent to love God, our choice to love God, that becomes so powerful here, and this is so much at the heart of Augustine's theology. Let's move forward. Congratulations may be in order. You're now today going to be halfway through the series. At this point, reading this challenging work may have you questioning, why am I bother reading this? I can only say from experience and what I've read of others who've gone deeper than I, that having read the Confessions about a half a dozen times in the course of my life, that every time it's been beneficial. Now, one of the things that Augustine himself reminds us is that the confession of evil works is the first beginning of good works. In other words, when we can recognize what is disordered or missing in ourselves, opens us to begin to fill that blank, to turn that twisted thing back right, and set us on a course for goodness. Peter Kreeft, a few quotes I'll address here that he touches on, that make reading this work very practical. He says, "Confessions is a good rehearsal for death, judgment, and purgatory, eventually heaven." It is not just ignorance, it is ignoring. We are not only very good at being bad, but we're also very good at self-deception. Augustine, particularly in this work of the Confessions, does not spare us. The same thing that blesses the blessed in heaven damns the damned in hell. Truth unconfessed tortures, truth confessed blesses and blisses. Truth is an absolute. Even hell is truth, but known too late. Great observations. St. Paul's letter to the Romans, "By our wickedness we suppress the truth." This touches on this tendency, as much as we might analyze things to death, that it's our wickedness that tends to trap us and tends to make us resist the truth. Augustine did this. We do this. This is a fairly universal phenomenon among fallen man. And finally, John reminds us in his gospel, "The light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil." Reading the Confessions to me is a bit like watching The Passion of the Christ. I think the movie is utterly fantastic, far and away the best I've ever seen. I can't ever say I've really enjoyed watching it. It's difficult. It's valuable. It's important to remember that the Confessions of Augustine is a prayer that we're being given the privilege to listen in on. There's times when we can easily reduce it to kind of just an autobiography, which it is, and a very rich one. But let's go back to prayer. A fellow doctor of the church, St. Teresa of Avila, writing in the 16th century, said this about prayer. Mental prayer, in my opinion, is nothing else than an intimate sharing between friends. It means taking time frequently to be alone with Him who we know loves us. The important thing is not to think much, but to love much, and so do that which best stirs you to love. Love is not great delight, but desire to please God in everything. If this looks familiar, it is. We first touched on Augustine's sense of the tripartite soul in the last section, but we're going to repeat it here with a little look at how it's going to play in his adolescent period. Augustine's theology of desire is simply this: appetite for physical pleasure, which we all experience, is ultimately a groaning for happiness in God, yet, as we're going to see in his adolescence, goes totally off the track. He turns away from God in so many respects. It easily becomes an attempt to satisfy it, in other words, our appetitive desire, with created goods instead of the Creator himself. This is what Augustine consistently describes as fornication, love of the music rather than the artist. And all of this will end in sorrow rather than joy. Joy is God himself. Everything below God, while not bad in any way, shape, or form, in fact is good. If that becomes God, it ends up in sorrow. Now, in Augustine's personal life, we see the parallel in the desire for nobility. He pursued outside of God popularity, wealth, power, articulation. We could go on. And it resulted in confusion and humiliation for him, not in glory. The desire for truth, when misdirected, leads to error. Augustine, at this stage, is going to begin to get into Manichaeism, which he will participate in for some 9 years or so of his life. And it would misdirect him and lead him away from God rather than toward him. So in other words, he became one of fear, doubt, and despair, rather than hope and confidence, the fruit of true faith. We see in the images here, Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. Not meaning to get in any way clever here, but the Manichaeism to which Augustine is going to get attached is a kind of new age of the ancient world. And if we know anything about the Star Wars and all of that sort of stuff, it's very New Ages, the light, dark, good, evil, as if they're kind of virtual absolutes. And again, we're going to see this kind of manifest itself in Augustine's life, as you might say he takes a trip to the dark side of the tripartite soul. Before we go much further, we better take a quick look at temptation, to define it, to clarify it for ourselves. Augustine's going to experience many temptations in here, and we need to understand temptation at its most fundamental level. The Catechism of the Catholic Church defines temptation as an attraction, either from outside oneself or from within, to act contrary to right reason and the commandments of God. A very fine priest in my adolescent period used to remind us frequently, Father Murphy was his name, that temptations make evil look somehow as if it is or will be good, when in fact it isn't. Now, if we look at the illustrations here, we see the devil as represented in Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, so wonderfully portrayed in here, I think, where it can be ugly at times and it can even be attractive at times. But we know that all temptation doesn't come from the devil. I personally can be easily tempted by chocolate, as manifest twice on the screen here. Certainly a good source of chocolate ice cream can take me down very easily. We can fall for the glamours of Hollywood. We can fall for the allure of wealth in the picture of Bernie Madoff, or as Adam and Eve did from the symbolic apple of the garden. These are temptations, and they easily lead us off track. Pope Benedict XVI gives us great guidance in coming to grips with those temptation or temptations that grip us, particularly those that might habitually grip us that we need to overcome. When he says, "Man is never wholly free from temptation, but with patience and true humility, we become stronger than any enemy. The patience and humility required to defeat the enemy comes by following Christ every day and from learning to build our life not outside of him or as if he did not exist, but in him and with him, because he is the source of true life. In contrast to this is the temptation to remove God, to order our lives and our world on our own, relying solely on our abilities." In this insightful paragraph, we see how we overcome temptation by humbly slugging it out day to day, trying to turn our lives consistently to God and avoid turning away from him. This, I think we can see in much of our secular world, is precisely the challenge. We're trying to solve the world's problems entirely on our own. This will never succeed. We know that as Christians. But yet it's a lesson that age after age has fallen into. It happened in Augustine's time. It happens in our own. To say that Augustine had a turbulent and complex adolescence is a great understatement. If you remember from last time, from age 12 to age 15, he studied at Madura, a town perhaps about 40 miles south of Tagaste. At the end of age 15, he returned home. The funds ran out, and so he returned home to Tagaste and had a year of idleness and friends unfriendly. And in a famous incident, certainly not an isolated one, he steals pears from a neighbor's tree. We'll spend some time on that shortly. Ages 16 to 17, and there is some debates on timelines here as far as events are concerned, but months of variation. Augustine moves from Tagaste, if you will, the picture of that town today, to Carthage, the sin city of the region. Patricius, his father, died, and Augustine takes a mistress, a concubine, whom he lived with for about 14 years. At age 18 or 19, Augustine becomes a Manichaean hearer. Now, this is a complex group that we'll talk about more as time goes on, but let's simply say that Augustine got off track spiritually, religiously, by being involved with the Manichaeans for so long. But during this same time, two wonderful things happened. Augustine read Cicero's Hortensius. Now, we don't have a copy of this work today, this work of philosophy, but this would set in motion forces in Augustine which would make him a truth seeker of the genuine sense. And it would also begin to get him to see the glories that he sought by being an orator, teacher of rhetoric, etc. He's beginning to doubt the ways of the world that he's been led to. Also, his son, Adeodatus, which means God-given, is born. Not only did a lot go on in Augustine's adolescent period, particularly these 3 or so years from his 16th to 19th years, but we also see how he described later, from that 43-year-old perspective, what was going on in his mind and in his heart. A very dark adolescence. Arrived now at adolescence, I burn for all the satisfactions of hell, and I sank to the animal in a succession of dark lusts. My beauty consumed away, and I stank in thine eyes. yet was pleasing in my own and anxious to please the eyes of men. We see Augustine here seeking his niche in life as an adolescent, so common in the adolescent world, trying to find your place, hence the conformity to the world, the competitiveness at times, trying to carve out your niche. And we see Augustine struggling and obviously turning very worldly in what we would describe very downward, sinking to the level of an animal. Augustine, again, is looking at this from a later stage, but it points to where he was becoming very worldly, very much away from God. Augustine, at the age of 16, took what students today often call as a gap year, a year away from education because he didn't have the funds. His father worked heavily that year in order to raise the funds for Augustine to continue his education the following year. And Augustine is caught between the city of the world and the city of God. Make your way in the world, seeking wealth, power, play, idleness, the business of things, or the city of God, to find your way home in, with, and through God, truth, goodness, and beauty. Well, we know in the short run that Augustine is going to choose mostly the former rather than the latter. And this, of course, is pivotal in all of human life, because this is the fundamental choice. We keep coming back to that. Keep that theme in mind as we move forward. Augustine, in his early adolescence, took a mistress, a concubine, who he remained with for some 14 years. This fresco, I believe it is the only representation of the two of them that seems to exist in the modern time. We never do learn of her name. Augustine never mentions it, and so her name is somewhat of a mystery. He clearly came to love her and love her deeply and became deeply attached to her. But because of her standing in a lower class of Roman society, they virtually could not marry and never did. In fact, just prior to his conversion, she was taken from him, which we'll describe later, and this caused great anguish to him. Now, as Augustine looks back at his early adolescence, he touches on some things again so very vividly about the adolescent mind, and in his case where the adolescent mind was going clearly off track. My one delight was to love and be loved, but in this I did not keep the measure of mind to mind, which is the luminous line of friendship, but from the muddy concupiscence of the flesh and the hot imagination of puberty, mist steamed up to becloud and darken my heart, so that I could not distinguish the white light of love from the fog of lust. Both love and lust boiled within me, and swept my youthful immaturity over the precipice of evil, desires to leave me half drowned in a whirlpool of abominable sins. Augustine, in Book 2, Part 3, gives one of the most concise and insightful readings on the effects of peer pressure in adolescence that I've ever read. We can read that together. I was ashamed among the other youths that my viciousness was less than theirs. I heard them boasting of their exploits, and the viler the exploits, the louder the boasting. And I set about the same exploits, not only for the pleasure of the act, but for the pleasure of the boasting. Nothing is utterly condemnable save vice. Yet I grew in vice through desire of praise. And when I lacked opportunity to equal others in vice, I invented things I had not done, lest I might be held cowardly for being innocent or contemptible for being chaste. This seems to be kind of the upside down description when adolescence runs amok, or when the power of peer pressure literally forces us to do that which is our own destruction. This, I think, is paralleled in Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 7, where we become the worst enemy of ourselves. Augustine at this time certainly was doing that. For those of you familiar with spiritual temperaments, Augustine's temperament or temperaments begin to clearly unveil themselves during this adolescent period. Augustine would be a melancholic choleric, perhaps reversing those two, but certainly these two traits of temperament are very clear in him. And we must remember that he is these things in a corrupt, declining, and decadent culture. Again, the end of the Roman Empire. Now, my suspicion is that his primary temperament was probably melancholic. Now, sometimes the Latin word for that is infelix, or unhappy. Melancholics, as we know, can be very comfortable in the kind of witnessing of sadness and sorrow. They are sensitive souls. They remember the past vividly, especially the hurts. They have a great capacity for depth of thought and reflection. They can be prone to analysis paralysis, where they'll forever analyze but never necessarily make resolution or convert. The final decision of his conversion will be difficult as a melancholic. It'll be slow and ponderous, but thorough. His secondary temperament seems to be choleric. We saw this in his childhood when we saw this competitive side coming out. Cholerics are prone to be aspiring, driven folks. Now, that will prevent him from being paralyzed by his melancholia. He will be somewhat practical and capable, as he served as bishop, and he clearly was not just a theoretical theologian, but a very truly good, down-to-earth, practical pastor. Now, the choleric pride can be very powerful in these types, and worldly success easily intoxicates them and motivates them. Augustine at this time, especially in his early adolescence, is lost in worldliness. He is a gifted man, of course, we know that, and he's comfortable in his driven abilities, indulged, unfortunately, by his sensualities, which are probably in his mind his making his way in the world, in his desire to be loved and to love, which may have been easily quite confused with simple lusts and desires. We know that he was into the theater. Now, a little aside, a celebrity of many of the stories of theater in and around Carthage was about Dido, the unhappy queen founder of Carthage, who was the defeated rival in this case. And she was what we would describe as a soap opera-like figure in the contemporary theater of Augustine's time. Much tragic theater surrounded her and indulged him during this period. If we seek evidence of Augustine's melancholic temperament, a reading from Part 2 of Book 3 reveals it vividly. In my wretchedness, I loved to be made sad, and sought for things to be sad about. And in the misery of others, though fictitious, and only on the stage, the more my tears were set to flowing, the more pleasure did I get from the drama, and more powerfully did it hold me. At this time he described himself as a wretched sheep, strayed from your fold and impatient of the shepherd. What wonder I became infected with a foul disease. That is why I love those sorrows, not that I wanted them to bite too deep, for I had no wish to suffer the sorrow I loved to look upon, but simply to scratch the surface of my heart as I saw them on the stage. Yet as if they had been fingernails, their scratching was followed by swelling and inflammation, and sore with pus flowing. Such was my life. But was that a life, my God? Definitely melancholic. Augustine's choleric side is revealed in these two quotes from Augustine, and then one that follows from Dr. Peter Kreeft. I stole from my parents' cellar and table, sometimes because I was gluttonous myself, sometimes to have something to give to the other boys in exchange for implements of play. Even in games, when I was clearly outplayed, I tried to win by cheating, from the vain desire for first place. At the same time, I was indignant and argued furiously when I caught anyone doing the very things that I had done to others. When I was caught myself, I would fly into a rage rather than give way. We read this second quote in Augustine's late childhood. We see the picture here of these two baseball stars some years ago, Mark Aguirre and Sammy Sosa, who hit home runs way beyond Babe Ruth, both in the same year. Of course, we know now that they were using steroids, performance-enhancing drugs, cheating on a grand scale for fame and glory, for a game. Peter Kreeft describes Augustine accurately here, I think, particularly coping with the flesh and the world. The world is often a more powerful temptation to lust than the flesh. Augustine, like us, is more ashamed to be ashamed in the sight of his friends by not sinning with them than he is in the sight of God for sinning. Like a good Freudian, he feels guilty about feeling guilty. Perhaps the most famous story in all of the Confessions, certainly involving the youth of Augustine, was what we might describe as the pear tree prank. Augustine begins to describe it in Book 2, Chapter 4, and I'm in about the middle of that paragraph. I chose to steal, and not because want drove me to it, unless a want of justice and contempt for it in an excess of iniquity. For I stole things which I already had in plenty and of better quality. Nor had I any desire to enjoy the things I stole, but only the stealing of them in the sin. There was a pear tree near our vineyard, heavy with fruit, but fruit that was not particularly tempting either to look at or to taste. A group of young blackguards, and I among them, went out to knock down the pears and carry them off late one night. For it was our bad habit to carry on our games in the streets till very late. We carried off an immense load of pears, not to eat, for we barely tasted them before throwing them to the hogs. Our only pleasure in doing it was that it was forbidden. Augustine goes on to analyze his heart at the carrying out of this prank. Such was my heart, O God, such was my heart. Yet in the depths of the abyss you had pity on it. Let that heart now tell you what it sought when I was thus evil for no object, have no cause for wrongdoing save my wrongness. The malice of the act was base, and I loved it. That is to say, I love my own undoing. I love the evil in me, not the thing for which I did the evil, simply the evil. My soul was depraved, and hurled itself down from security in you into utter destruction, seeking no profit from the wickedness, but only to be wicked. While Augustine is analyzing his own heart, he's going deeper and deeper. We see this capacity for self-examination. I'm now going to go on to part 6, the very beginning of part 6, and I'll do 2 readings at the beginning and near the end of that part. What was it then in my wretched folly I loved in you, O theft of mine, deed wrought in that dark night when I was 16? For you were not lovely, you were a theft. Or are you anything at all that I should talk with you? The pears that we stole were beautiful, for they were created by thee, thou most beautiful of all, creator of all, thou good God, my sovereign and true good. The pears were beautiful, but it was not pears that my empty soul desired, for I had a number of better pears of my own, and plucked those only that I might steal. For once I had gathered them, I threw them away, tasting only my own sin, and savoring that with delight. For if I took so much as a bite of any one of those pears, it was the sin that sweetened it. So once again, what did I enjoy in that theft of mine? Of what excellence of my Lord was I making perverse and vicious imitation? Perhaps it was the thrill of acting against your law, at least in appearance, since I had no power to do so in fact. The delight a prisoner might have in making some small gesture of liberty, getting a deceptive sense of omnipotence from doing something forbidden without immediate punishment. I was that slave who fled from his Lord and pursued his Lord's shadow. O rottenness, O monstrousness of life, an abyss of death! Could you find pleasure only in what was forbidden, and only because it was forbidden? I'll move on to part 8. What fruit, therefore, had I in my vileness in those things of which I am now ashamed, especially in that piece of thieving in which I loved nothing except the thievery? Though that in itself was no thing, and I only the more wretched for it. Now, as I think back on the state of my mind then, I am altogether uncertain that I would not have done it alone. Perhaps then what I really loved was the companionship of those with whom I did it. If so, can I still say that I loved nothing over and above the thievery? What is the thing that I am trying to get at in all this discussion? If I had liked the pears that I stole and wanted to enjoy eating them, I might have committed the offense alone. If that had been sufficient to get me the pleasure I wanted, I should not have needed to inflame the itch of my desires by rubbing against accomplices. But since the pleasure I got was not in the pears, it must have been in the crime itself, and put there by the companionship of others sinning with me. And now from book 9, or part 9. Here then, O God, is the memory still vivid in my mind. I would not have committed that theft alone. My pleasure was not what I stole, but that I stole. Yet I would not have enjoyed doing it. I would not have done it alone. O friendship unfriendly, unanalyzable attraction for the mind, greediness to do the damage for the mere sport and jest of it, desire for another's loss with no gain to oneself, or vengeance to be satisfied. Someone cries, "Come on, let's do it," and we would be ashamed to be ashamed. The final part of Book 2, Part 10, Augustine makes the following appeal to God. Who can unravel that complex, twisted knottedness? It is unclean. I hate to think of it or look at it. I long for thee, O justice and innocence, joy and beauty of the clear of sight. I long for thee with an unquenchable longing. There is sure repose in thee and life untroubled. He that enters into thee enters into the joy of his Lord, and shall not fear and shall not be well in him who is the best. I went away from thee, my God, in my youth. I strayed too far from thy sustaining power, and I became to myself a barren land. In this last appeal, this last prayer to God, Augustine is in many senses describing himself in the region of need and poverty, the same as the prodigal son. And so he was. Early in Book 2, in Part 5, in fact, Augustine summarizes fornication. And his fornications, if you will, whether he's stealing the pears or messing about with a young woman, is always getting at the idea that the creation has become more attractive than the creator. This life we live here below has its own attractiveness, grounded in the measure of beauty it has, and its harmony with the beauty of all lesser things. The bond of human friendship is admirable, holding many souls as one. Yet in the enjoyment of all such things we commit sin, if through immoderate inclination to them, for though they are good, they are of the lowest order of good. Things higher and better are forgotten, even you, O Lord our God. and your truth and your law. These lower things have their delights, but not such as my God has. For he made them all, and in him doth the righteousness delight, and he is the joy of the upright of heart. In summary, Augustine's 16th through roughly 18th or 19th years were extremely turbulent and very eventful. What a way to begin adolescence, and just how far the train had gone off track. In 371, Augustine went to study at Carthage. His father had managed to raise funds, so from his roughly 16th year, which was largely a year off, in which he got into all kinds of things, he's now going to be returning to Carthage, which he describes as a cauldron of illicit loves. He frequents the theater and kept company, coarse company, he said, with a group of companions he called wreckers. He entered into a long-term relationship with an unnamed woman from the lower class. Because she was in the lower class, it was not practical for Augustine to marry her. They stayed together for 14 years, roughly, and he did develop a very deep affection for her and remained faithful to her for most of their time together, it appears. There may have been some transgressions early on there, but he seemed to genuinely develop a deep love for her. In 372, 373, depending on which timeline you follow, Adeodatus is born of this relationship. Adeodatus, translated, means gift from God. Augustine took deep delight in this, and perhaps in a wonderful irony, the two of them would be baptized together in Augustine's 32nd year. Adeodatus was a gifted young man, seemingly having the great intellectual gifts of his father. In 372 to 373, somewhere in there, Patricius, after securing the funds to continue Augustine's education, died. He was baptized on his deathbed. It was literally that deathbed conversion. But it seemed to be more than just a last-second, kind of desperate reprieve. There seemed to be a change of heart in him. He genuinely repented for his infidelities that hurt and insulted Monica over the years. And in fact, it's said that he developed a cold contempt for his marital infidelities and for his failure to give Augustine the guidance and self-discipline needed for his turbulent adolescence. Augustine, in fact, near the end of Book 9, asks that readers pray for both of his parents with devout affection. This would have been the year of his conversion, shortly after the time of Monica's death. And so Augustine seemed to have a tenderness for his father, in spite of some of his father's somewhat abusive sides, particularly directed at his mother. In Book 3, Augustine touches on his reading of a book by Cicero called Hortensius. Now, there is no known copy of Hortensius which still exists. Our only evidence of the book comes from the reading of Augustine and a few others. But in this reading, we see a beginning of at least an intellectual change in Augustine. Augustine is going to become a genuine seeker of truth. This is a seed of hope that is planted in Augustine. At that unstable period of my life, I studied books of eloquence, wherein I was eager to be eminent from a damnable and inflated purpose, even a delight in human vanity. In the ordinary course of study, I lighted upon a certain book of Cicero, whose language, though not his heart, almost all admire. This book of his contains an exhortation to philosophy, and is called Hortensius. This book, in truth, changed my affections, and turned my prayers to thyself, O Lord, and made me have other hopes and desires. Worthless suddenly became every vain hope to me, and with an incredible warmth of heart I yearn for an immortality of wisdom, and I began now to arise that I might return to thee, not then to improve my language, which I appear to be purchasing with my mother's means. And in that my 19th year, my father having died 2 years before, not to improve my language did I have recourse to that book, nor did it persuade me by its style, but its matter. The melancholic in Augustine is seeking depth, and certainly his life up to this point in adolescence is not providing that at all. He was a choleric pursuing with intensity the wild things of his life. But suddenly he finds himself, having first read this book of Cicero's, to try to seek the eloquence that everybody seemed to admire about it. The eloquence did not persuade him. The content did. And so he began to pivot in his genuine affections. He began to seek things greater and deeper. We might say in this moment, we can see the beginning of the conversion of St. Augustine. Let's take this initial conversion of Augustine a little bit deeper. Augustine would have been experiencing internal conflicts. Now, the great German theologian Romano Guardini describes this well from his book, The Conversion of St. Augustine, another work I'd recommend. He, Augustine, experiences the contradiction between the drive of his youthful senses and ambitions and the will of his mother, who represents Christian and family tradition. But soon, also, as the contradiction between the crude or refined licentiousness of his Carthaginian surroundings and his own nobler sentiments, as we see from the beginning of the second and third books. Thereafter, the conflict moves inward, becoming more significant, and Augustine interprets it as the clash between the universal power of goodness light and evil darkness in his own heart. Now, this is Manichaeism that Augustine is going to struggle with over the next roughly 9 years of his life. This view conveniently relieves him of any personal responsibility and allows him to experience the whole problem merely as an aesthetic, tragic, universal condition. Finally, he realized that evil as a principle does not exist, that God is the good per se, and evil merely the negation of God, that the conflict lies entirely within oneself, between one's obedience to God and one's rebellious self-assertion. Just a word before I give you some closing words to reflect on. Augustine is at a pivotal point. He's changing from his wild adolescence, but he doesn't yet have arrived at a point in which he can begin to truly convert. In part 4, we're going to dwell into his Manichaeism, how he got into it more deeply, and how eventually it would become unsatisfactory for him. Augustine, in his thoroughness, will have a long and slow and ponderous conversion. But continue your reading at the pace you find effective and acceptable to you. Get what you can from the text. Be patient again in your reading of the text. It's wonderful material. And again, I hope it finds fruit in your life. Some closing thoughts. Beware of despairing about yourself. You are commanded to put your trust in God and not in yourself. Do you wish to rise? Begin by descending. You plan a tower that will pierce the clouds? Lay first the foundation of humility. Christ is not valued at all unless he is valued above all. And finally, from St. John Eudes, he longs to be in you. He wants his breath to be your breath, his heart in your heart, and his soul in your soul. God bless.